Thanks everyone for being here. This is Raising the Curtain on Transactions. What do librarians need to know about the research integrity landscape? And so I want to start off by asking how many of you are librarians? If you could, okay, great, excellent. Well, thanks for being here. I think this is an important topic. I assume you already know something about retractions or research integrity, and that's probably why you're here. I have to admit, I had only a vague familiarity on this topic until just a few years ago. And it's something that has really evolved in both size and complexity over the last several years. Even really since we first came up with the idea of having this panel discussion earlier this year, it's evolved. If we had more time, I would show you some slides and charts on the topic, because honestly, it's fascinating to see how it's changed. But we don't have time for that. We've got a relatively tight schedule and 4 panelists, and we want to give each of them time to say what they have to say on the topic. They're the experts, I'm not. But I think we're all likely to learn something today from the panelists. But I want to start off by first honoring your presence here. My personal opinion is that librarians are stakeholders in this subject, but I know that many librarians may not necessarily feel that way. So whether you believe your role is as an informed consumer or maybe an active participant, I hope that you listen today for what the role of a librarian could be or should be in this issue, alongside the other stakeholders, authors, publishers, research institutions, et cetera. I know that my own personal opinion is, at the very least, what librarians can do in this matter is do what it takes to get their users to use the library instead of going to pirate websites, because that is a problem in this ecosystem that contributes to the issues of research integrity. So alongside that, I think if you listen to the role of technology in this matter as both a cause and a potential solution, I think that's another key topic that I know some of the panelists will be talking about today. So, and I hope that you take what you learn here today back to your institutions and share it in whatever manner you consider to be appropriate. So we'll start off by having the panelists do a quick introduction, and then I'll pose some questions.
Want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. Hi, I'm Adia Misra. I'm the Associate Director of Research Integrity at SAGE. I've been at SAGE for 2 years, and I oversee all of our research integrity work across the journals portfolio. So it's focusing on research journals. We also publish books, but I don't really get involved with those. And I wanted to give you a fun fact that actually, ever since I started at SAGE, I've retracted about 872 articles. Thank you.
That's hard to follow. I have not retracted any articles. I'm Shannon Pritting. I'm the director of the library at Empire State University. And my perspective on the panel is, I've got about 15 years of experience as a director at what I would term research aspirational institutions. So institutions that want to increase their research output, more grants, but don't have that infrastructure that can handle research integrity. And my approach is always, how do I keep good faculty in the institution as they go through these types of processes and pressures to publish more? Turn it over to Sean.
So my name is Sean Reif. I'm head of academic relations at Research Solutions. I'm also associate professor of psychology at Murray State University in Kentucky. My background is in social psychology, and I have not had any papers retracted, but I did have one almost had to at least have an editorial notice appended to it. But someone alerted us to the coding error prior to publication, so we were able to fix it. So narrow dodge there.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Streeter. I'm a Director of Research Integrity, Strategy, and Policy at Wiley. In my role, I have responsibility for policy development that underlines our research integrity work, both in investigations and also some of the editorial policies that we have in place that underpin peer review and things like that. Unlike Adia, I have no idea how many retractions I have responsibility for, but it is a very difficult landscape that we're working in. And I think some of the conversation that we'll kind of draw out today, too, is really about how we're working more collaboratively outside the publisher with stakeholders like librarians, with research integrity sleuths, and with others. So thanks for being here.
All right, thanks. So the first question that I'm going to pose to the panel is, what are the roles and responsibilities of various stakeholders in a retraction? And Mike, I think I'll turn that one to you first.
Sure. So I'm speaking from a publisher perspective. I think there are a couple of different ways to look at it. We have responsibility for what we publish. So that's what goes into the scholarly record, what's there. We have responsibility for the integrity of that record. So maybe that's a correction that needs to happen, perhaps a retraction or something else. We also have responsibility for identifying these issues further upstream before they make it into the record. So there's a level of screening and investigation that goes into those responsibilities. One of the words in the title of this presentation is also demystification. And one of the roles I think publishers play that might not be realized is that we wrangle a lot of the communications around a retraction. So I know we're focused on retractions, but a retraction is an editorial decision that's made by an editor-in-chief in most cases. We, in very many cases, need to advocate for a certain decision to be made. We sometimes need to manage communications not only across editors and authors, but also across institutions and other stakeholders who have a role in that research. So that's where I would not draw all of the lines around our research integrity responsibilities, but some of the high-level ones.
Anybody else have it? Sean?
Getting to the core of the question, retractions are themselves, in my opinion, not the responsibility of librarians. I'm a little defensive of librarians in this respect. The responsibility is communicating that a retraction has occurred, but it's only possible for y'all to do that, of course, if the publisher and the scholars responsible have done their job to make sure that information is represented very well. And there are plenty of instances that I can point to where you could look at the article landing page for a paper and have no idea that paper was retracted. Not to pick on publishers too much, sorry, but it wasn't either of your outlets. But this is, I think librarians are at sort of the end of the stream of sort of responsibility of this, at the communication with individual students and scholars. And they depend a lot on people like me and people like us, publishers, to make sure that information is communicated properly.
So I'm just going to ask a question of the audience. How many of you have a dedicated research integrity officer at your institution? All right, so that's about what I thought it was going to be. I know we're not all librarians here, but I've worked a lot of years at institutions that have no research integrity officer, and sometimes like a 0.10 VP of research, right? So, the librarians are put into this ecosystem and this issue when retractions happen, and I've been involved in a couple dozen of them, with either someone accusing someone else or, so someone was plagiarized or did something that, led to a retraction or a correction. And usually what I try to do as the librarian in that role is, try to say what is reasonable to expect of us in that area, and what are our professional competencies. And I usually tell people, we have to think that good literature reviewing is part of our professional competency. And often if a faculty is involved in this and they're navigating this process on their own, especially if they're not tenured, they're having to interact with the provost, they're having to interact with a variety of people. And, honestly, they're scared because this is a huge decision for them. So usually as a librarian, I'm contextualizing, I'm, if it's appropriate, advocating, because, sometimes academics aren't always the most understanding people, especially if someone's presenting them a problem that they don't want. So that's a role that I think, it's unnamed, but a lot of librarians are playing that. Some of them might just say that's not my problem, and I think that's also a valid response. But if you want to engage through your liaison librarians or someone at an administrative level, that's a really good way to build trust, because usually the faculty colleagues plus the faculty who's involved in it see the value of a librarian in a way that you're not going to get by helping them with journal metrics for their publications through promotion and tenure.
So I think we haven't talked about the main stakeholders here, the researchers who sit at the heart of pretty much everything. Journal editors, reviewers, authors, all part of the same community. I think they play a huge role in research, retractions, all of this. So I feel like there is a place for librarians to help faculty understand some of these processes and maybe steward them to better research decisions rather than put everything at the end with publishers and journals. Really start upstream, talk to them about incentives to publish, talk to them about how research is conducted. And I think there is a role maybe that librarians could play in this if they aren't already.
Thanks, everyone. So one quick follow-up question before we move on to the next topic. How well do publishers share info about their investigations into research integrity?
Well, do you want to take it?
I can't remember who was supposed to take it, but if you're happy to, I could chip in.
Yeah, I think we're historically not so good at sharing information with external, let's say, stakeholders. So we're here to demystify retractions because I think we've done a bad job. But when we're mid-investigation in a case or a concern on an article, we can't typically share that information because it's confidential, and it's the cornerstone of everything we do as publishers has to uphold that confidentiality. And people get very frustrated with us. As you know, we don't share enough information, we don't give timelines, we don't give clear deadlines. Well, it's difficult. We're working with academics who are very busy, working with journal editors who are very busy, working with institutions who don't have dedicated research integrity support. And we often do need institutional support in carrying out some of these investigations. So I think there is a little bit more that needs to happen in terms of collaboration between publishers, journals, and institutions. But I think if we talk about collaboration between publishers, that's a completely different ballgame, and that's completely changing. And I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're familiar with the Committee on Publication Ethics, they have roughly 10-year-old guidelines about sharing information between journals on an investigation. And we loosely follow those guidelines and the principles behind those guidelines and how we share with SAGE or how we might share with Frontiers about what we're looking at that could impact their portfolio. So we have a framework to work within. But if you were at the session prior to this with Ivan Ronsky and Elizabeth Bick, they talked a fair amount about the problem of paper mills and the problem of scale that we're dealing with. One of the ways that we are sharing, perhaps not article level detail, but another way that we are sharing information is we are working within industry associations like the STM Association and like the Committee on Publication Ethics, where we talk about different types of patterns that we see and some of this manipulation. Are you seeing X in this group of manuscripts? We just found this. You might want to look up for that. That's another level of sharing that we're doing, which I have found to be probably one of the more important strategic things that we've been doing over the course of the last 3 or 4 years as publishers.
Can I just ask a question of something you spoke of a minute ago? You said you have confidentiality agreements in place. What is the rationale for those agreements? I've never had the opportunity to ask anyone. Can you elaborate on that any?
Yeah, of course. So I think if you think about somebody who's noticed something weird going on in their university, contacted a journal, they probably don't want their name to be revealed to the
You're talking about the person who sort of blew the whistle. I
exactly.
See. Gotcha.
So I think people who write to us, they're often worried about peer consequences because they're in a small community. Journal editors, I feel, sometimes really hesitant to retract papers because they are still part of that research community, which is often quite small, and they're worried about consequences for their career. So I think some of that is really challenging to work with.
I don't know about you, but that exchange gives me a whole bunch of questions, which I'm not going to actually ask at the moment. I'm going to try to keep us on the agenda here, but we are going to try to leave 5 to 10 minutes for the audience to ask questions. So please keep that in mind if you've got a good one in response to that. I look forward to it. The next main question here. there's a proliferation of screening tools on the market. Technology plays a key role in upholding the quality of what's published. Will technology solve the problems of research integrity? Sean, I think I'll call on you first for that one.
No.
Can you elaborate?
No, I mean, this is like, I'm against all monocausal explanations. I'm also against any sort of one-size-fits-all solution. There are tools that are great that, and at Cite, we've developed some, and we participated in some of those toolkits, and I think those were wonderful toolkits. I know the people who work with screening tools. But the underlying issue, and I say this more as a person who publishes articles and has been through the tenure process, the underlying issue here is one of incentives. It's a sociological problem. And it's a sociological problem with no easy fix, especially a technical one. Again, not throwing shade on those individual tools because they are very valuable. But the underlying core of the issue is about the incentive structures for researchers.
I would say a lot of the technological tools, and so we have our faculty are completely remote, so they're all over the world, and been in multiple cases, and a lot of things that don't get to a retraction but become an issue with screening really impact international faculty where English is not their first language, and they might work with an editor or use other tools to improve sentence level meaning. And I think we just need to acknowledge that and understand how that fits with our commitment in higher education to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is it's international. We should want to allow different paths that don't require that English is your first language.
If I could add a quick thing too, maybe kind of following on the points that you both made. First off, I agree that technology is not the only solution. It is a solution that is a tool that we can use as speaking from a publisher point of view to look for patterns. I think the other thing to think about too is we don't want screening to sort of adopt this kind of oversight, big brother type of a label. We're not only looking for research misconduct further upstream, we're also looking for ways to improve manuscripts. Are there conflict of interest disclosures missing in a manuscript that should be there? Can we intercept that prior to sending a paper out to peer review? In the last session, it talked about retractions and citations of retractions. Can we identify whether a paper is citing a retraction that shouldn't be? And is the author aware that they're citing a retracted paper? Can we intercept that piece of it as well?
I guess something we don't talk about a lot is screening sort of published literature. There's no real way to see what's out there and how good it is. And it's got a whole lot of problems about who would take that responsibility. But if you go on Google and you look for any type of output, how do you know which one's good? How do you know which one's retracted? Is there a quick way of doing it? But we don't really have a way of screening published literature, especially if we talk about how published literature is increasing. Let's say publishing volumes increasing, pace is increasing. We don't really have a good way. We don't talk about that enough. We talk a lot about screening submissions because we want to tackle things upstream. But what about the reader? What about the librarian? How do you know which paper is good and which journal is good? Is that something that you're all thinking about? I wonder if there is an opportunity also for us to be talking about somebody, not publishers, but somebody to develop metrics or ways of identifying good content, separating the wheat from the chaff, really. That's becoming important, I think.
Can I respond to that? Anytime I hear metrics related to something like this, my initial response that I know I need to kind of get through is I've never met a group of people who are so good at assessing a process with metrics involved in it and then exploiting it repeatedly, systematically as academic faculty. And that, that's where I think like there's no one solution that won't, it needs to be holistic and multiple approaches. But I mean, I don't disagree with you, but I'm like, yes, I could see how people are going to get around that, and I'm sure
not another impact factor.
Yeah.
Well, All right, thanks. So I know there's been a lot of talk about trust markers. So can somebody from the panel describe what they are and if they have a role to play in this? Maybe Mike or Adi would be.
Sure. I mean, the one that immediately comes to mind, but I mean, to Shannon's point, I mean, everything is open to some sort of manipulation, is to think about ORCIDs that are associated with an author, potentially with a peer reviewer, that gives you a sense of the description of the work that they have been doing throughout the course of their career. So Mike Streeter submits a article to Adya's journal. Adya is biochemistry and molecular science. Mike puts a paper in there, but his history is all in engineering and concrete. So, being able to understand precisely the background that a submitting author or a peer reviewer might have, and the expertise that they bring to it, I think is the type of trust marker that we're looking at. And I wonder if site is also a place that we might think about or consider a trust marker sort of in this space.
Yeah, I think that, at Site, we're really built around the idea of, using citations and leveraging the content of citations. So, what we do is we extract the text of a citation from papers and we compile summaries of how papers have been cited, among other things. I think that going to actually evaluating the content of citations is a way of post-publication review and surfacing potentially problematic articles if they're failing to replicate things like that. If we do a good job of that, that information will be useful. I'll be a little bit defensive of a new impact factor. If we could come up with some metric that actually contains the content of the citations, that information embedded, that's something, yeah.
I would just say I can only await having to figure out how to administratively figure that out for faculty who want a trust marker added to their publication to get through tenure and promotion, right? They're like, it's not enough. I also want a trust marker. So are you thinking about like proactive trust marker requests that would be kind of like an APC?
No, I guess I'm thinking more about the whole like academic ecosystem or scholarly ecosystem and how people think about relationships between pieces of scholarship.
Yeah, and I guess that's just I deal mostly interpersonally with faculty who are going through this, and I think that would be if you start to have trust markers that are in addition to you're published in a peer review with this impact factor. I think faculty are going to ask, please do a post peer review of my publications so that it can be rock solid when I go up for promotion, tenure, etc.
I think in some ways, you talk about post-peer review, which made me think about open research practices as another form of maybe not formalized trust markers, but there's a lot of discussion right now about preprinting and the value of preprinting. And it certainly it's more popular in some disciplines than in others. It's more popular in some regions than in others. But certainly in some disciplines, if a paper is not preprinted by the time it gets submitted to a journal, that is considered a red flag. So in physics and mathematics, there's a very well understood practice of preprinting prior to submission. So I think this is another way that we can think about kind of less formalized scores and metrics. But I think that to your point, Sean, is what we want behind those things are some substance, right?
Do we, real quick, do we like badges on journal articles? You know what I'm talking about? The open research practices, open data, that to me is another example of a good, useful trust marker.
Yeah.
I guess.
I get the feeling we've hit on a topic here that we could spend the rest of our time discussing, which if there end up not being any questions from the audience, maybe we will come back to some of that. But I do want to keep us moving forward here because we got a couple more questions before we engage the audience. So here's a provocative one. Are all retractions bad?
No. Some retractions are really good and really desperately needed, especially at scale. We've been, unfortunately, quite slow at getting to the stage of being comfortable retracting. There's a lot of stigma around retractions. I think I'll be very controversial now and say that stigma is actually good for certain individuals. It is a way to get bad actors to stop attacking journals. But I think that stigma is also misplaced in other stakeholders. So complainants I already talked about, they're very worried about consequences. Journal editors are very worried about consequences because they almost assume that I made a mistake, that therefore this paper I accepted is going to be retracted. The authors who are actually finding errors in their research and that has to be subsequently retracted are probably worried and probably not as able to proactively request retractions. But yes, I think in some places the stigma is really needed and we shouldn't get rid of it. And I think there are some conversations about removing the stigma, which do worry me. But I think in general, retractions are not bad. And I think we should be doing more of them as publishers, at least.
I don't know that I agree about the stigma. So I agree in part that stigmatization serves a useful purpose. I might reframe that just a little bit and say that, you know, in terms of going back to I always go back to the sort of incentive structure, it might, like, I can think of if my tenure were dependent on one publication that might be retracted, it might be useful if my institution had the flexibility to say, yes, we know that paper was retracted, but well, Sean, you initiated the retraction. You withdrew it voluntarily. We count that as a plus, not a minus. So in understanding the reasons for the retraction, I think might be helpful.
Anyone else have?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working with a faculty who just submitted her tenure and promotion packet and had 2 corrected articles. So we were talking about retractions. That's different. But you know, I think we just need to acknowledge that whether we think of them as bad or good, you know, every tenure and promotion committee is slightly different. And, you know, this might be something we could come back to is like, how do we figure out ways as librarians or faculty or whomever is doing that at the institution to support faculty through that? Because, you know, they did their best, hoping that they did their best and it wasn't intentional. You know, what I did was wrote a letter after examining the evidence, just saying like, you know, this was something that wasn't, you know, a major issue. She didn't initiate the correction, but it was a methods correction that she was an early career researcher that, you know, was trying to do what she thought was best for her career, and someone else picked it out. I mean, I think that's what you have to really look at is, you know, more the you know, the lifelong learning growth mindset instead of like, let's punish and label and stigmatize people for the rest of their career. Believe me, there are people who retractions are needed and they should probably not, you know, not get the benefit of the doubt. But most, I think, are just errors or someone trying to do something they weren't ready for yet.
If I could add something too quickly, I guess reflecting on everything that's been said here, from a kind of a real practical point of view, and Adja can back me up on this if she wants. In the current landscape that we're working in, we think about retractions in a couple of different ways. One, in cases where we're managing single article investigations, or perhaps an investigation that includes a few articles. There might be cases of honest researcher error that are impacting that investigation or leading to that investigation. There might be cases of sort of lower scale research misconduct, like p-hacking, that sort of drives us to retract in a particular case. But then we have cases of, we've talked about large scale retractions, where we're doing mass retractions, where we might be retracting hundreds or perhaps even thousands of retractions at a given time. And that puts us in a difficult position, I think, as publishers. And I'm not sort of bemoaning my station, but in those cases where we're looking at single articles or where we're looking at maybe a handful of articles, we can be very clear about the rationale for that retraction. And, you know, in many cases actually in all cases where authors are bringing these issues to publishers, they're being made a party to that retraction. So the article is being retracted by the editor, by the publisher, and by the author, right? And we're acknowledging that. It's much more difficult when we're looking at things where we may be dealing with a paper mill and we have to act quickly and we have to act at scale and we have to tackle hundreds of papers at once. The one practical bit of advice that I would give, I think, to the librarians in the room is that most publishers do have a research integrity team that you can contact and you can ask them about a retractions that has happened. And if this is coming up in tenure discussions or other types of discussions at the institution, I would encourage you to reach out to the publisher and ask questions about that retraction.
All right, I've got one last question here, and I'm going to ask that you keep your answers to this one short if possible so that we can engage the audience. Is there a message you'd like to deliver to researchers and authors on this subject? I'll start with Shannon on this one.
Yeah, I think this is a message I clearly and repeatedly communicate is we need to publish less peer-reviewed journals. And I think we need to hit that demand problem systematically at scale. And, we should be having every single year the number of peer-reviewed publications. And the only way we do that is to do the hard work, which is to work at different levels to connect into the peer review process. And I think unless we do that, we're just going to be chasing this issue for a very long time.
Lots of, go ahead, Adia.
No, I was just going to say I really support that message, and I think the only thing I want to add is that if we don't get there, or by the time we get there, can authors be really careful about who they work with? I think it's really important that you don't just reply to an email asking you to become a co-author because it's a really cool study topic. Do a bit more vetting, meet people, that kind of thing. Forge a collaboration, not just become an author. That mentality switch really would be really helpful.
I agree with all of that.
I was just going to say really quickly, authorship issues, I think, are one of the more challenging ones for publishers. And I think there is a lack of education about what it means to be an author and what qualifies someone for authorship. And so to your point, Adia, I think that is one of the messages that I would bring as a publisher, because it both comes down to these authorship issues where we are seeing active cases of authorship for sale on social media. And this is not behind the scenes. This is very blatant. And we are seeing these issues, identity issues, coming into the journals. So.
All right. I think, do we have questions from the audience? Okay. We've got here we go.
Thanks very much for very interesting discussion. I just wanted more of a comment than a question. I know that's a disastrous thing to say. Around trust markers, I don't know, it didn't come up in the conversation. Been working with a group from STM who have just recently published a draft report on what trust markers mean, really from the publishing side, around establishing digital identity for. So essentially, when you say you are somebody, are you that person? Are you, is your identity correct? It's around protecting that identity so that, to make sure that we're heading off submissions that are somehow problematic. Also things like people trying to establish that they publish in a certain area that they previously haven't done. And there's more work from that to come. It's available from the STM website. It's really, rather than starting a huge big discussion, which I would love to do, I refer people to that. I think it's, and it's been widely disseminated on things like LinkedIn. So that might be a good resource for people to look at.
Can I ask a quick, sorry.
I read it on the way here. It's very good and it's worth reading. Yes.
Can I just ask, how are you handling interdisciplinary research, which is highly encouraged at most institutions? So people would be publishing mid-career or late career outside of their discipline. Just curious. Or if that's come up.
From a research integrity perspective, where we're seeing issues of where someone is not publishing in their discipline, and that's become a problem, it's usually a scale issue as opposed to a one-off type of an issue, right? I used to work really close. I used to work in political science, and one of the political scientists I work with is now he's at Oklahoma University, and he's sort of moved on from looking at state and local legislatures to studying political architecture. Like that's what he does now, right? So you can see the sort of natural progression, right? But I think for us, it's typically scale. It seems very much out of the ordinary usually.
I think the only thing I can tell you is that paper mills know about that and they're taking advantage of it because I know that institutions are encouraging interdisciplinary collaboration, international collaborations. We're seeing that with paper mills too.
Yeah.
Got another question here.
I'm Alex Carroll. I'm a librarian at Vanderbilt. I'm also a journal editor as well. So I guess we talked a lot about incentive structures. And I guess one thing I'm curious about is what incentives we can put in place for journal editors specifically in this retraction space, right? Because I think about myself, right? When you get a retraction or, you have an investigation sort of be prompted, right? Almost everything that happens from the editor standpoint is bad, right? Where it's like, if I retract this article, the authors are mad at me, right? If I don't retract this article, the people that have instigated the investigation feel like I'm not taking the complaint seriously enough. And so I know it's a difficult one, but what ideas do we have in this space?
I don't know if I have an idea. I would say that we're never going to be at a position where we're not needing to retract an article. And, the way, and not the way that Wiley sees it, but the way that all publishers see it, is that a retraction is an editorial decision to be made. I mean, I think, probably the best incentive that I could think of is you're likely worse off not retracting than you are actually retracting. But I think you also kind of point to this issue of kind of pressure that you're under as a journal editor. You have angry authors, or you perhaps have some kind of pressure externally saying, hey, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but you need to be retracting this article because of X, Y, and Z. And I think because of the pressure to do retractions quickly that is also out there, there's an incentive to perhaps not do as thorough of an investigation. But I would push back on that. And I'd say that we have as much a responsibility to correct the record as we do a responsibility to the authors to ensure that there's a level of fairness in that investigation, and to, as much as possible, have our processes in place to ensure that retraction and the reason it's been done is transparent, and that as much as possible, the authors have an ability to weigh in on that decision, or perhaps defend themselves against a potential concern that's been raised.
I think this also actually speaks to something that I wanted to note, which is I think that would be aided by the public, librarians, students, faculty, having a more nuanced understanding of what the science is, science as method, science as a continually updating and ideally self-correcting enterprise, which speaks to how we, again, sometimes you want to stigmatize retractions, but I think that goes to that other point, sometimes you don't, and that feeds into the incentive structure.
I would just say, like, as a response to that, like, I think I don't have a solution, but at least a response, which is, I think we need to acknowledge what this does to the volunteer roles of journal editors, because I've managed a lot of volunteers in my life. And once things start to get into like, kind of quasi personnel management in a negative way, that is going to lead to people quitting volunteer positions and saying, like, I have better things to do with my free time. And I think that's really what we need to acknowledge, of maybe retractions need to be outside of the editorial roles, unless these editorial roles are paid positions, not volunteer positions. And I think, just like that's part of the logistics. I don't have the answer, but I think we're going to see that as it really expands. We have a question here.
Well, we might be out of time. Yeah, we are out of time. So sorry that we didn't get all the questions in. I just got to say, to wrap it up, self-correcting enterprise. That's the terminology I was looking for when I was having a conversation with my Uber driver on the way here this morning, talking about what we were doing. That's
Okay.
all right. Thanks, everyone, for your attendance.